welcome to the 10th episode of our new podcast, the CHC Podcast. I am Anna Jaworski and a heart mom to an adult with a single ventricle heart who just happens to be in our guest audience today. And I also have two wonderful co-hosts with me.
I am Jason Crutchley. I'm a double organ transplant recipient.
And I am Leslie Castro, and I am a heart transplant recipient that received a Hep C donor heart.
And I'm so excited for Jason and Leslie to take over the interview portion of this episode. I'll be wearing a producer's cap today, but I'll be back at the end of the meeting along with my co-producer, Ayrton Beatty, to talk with Lori Hill, Jessica Carmel, and Guy Simkay about what we learned from the panel discussion.
Today's town hall meeting deals with cardiac transplantation. The first heart transplant was done in South Africa in December of 1967 by Dr. Christiaan Barnard, with pediatric heart transplants following close behind. Through the years, the operation itself, donor and recipient matching procedures, and post-transplant management has evolved to what it is today. Heart transplantation is becoming more common in the CHD community as CHDers are living longer and running out of palliative surgical options. Research is being done to develop new surgeries and protocols to increase quality and quantity of life for CHDers, but in the meantime, transplant can be a great option for those who are candidates.
Guy Simkay was born in Israel with transposition of the great vessels, double outlet right ventricle, and a ventricular septal defect. He received his heart transplant at the age of 46 at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, but is hoping to move back to New York City soon. Lori is a 26-year-old with a complex single ventricle composed of the right dominant, complete AV canal, and double outlet right ventricle. She had 3 palliative heart surgeries, providing her moderate relief. During her time in college, her single ventricle heart could not keep up. Since she was out of surgical options, she was listed for transplant in 2020 and received the gift of life over a year later. She is now using her new quality of life to become a physician assistant to give back to the CHD and transplant communities.
Jessica Carmel was born with hypoplastic left heart syndrome. She lived with a Fontan heart for years before needing a heart transplant. After her transplant, she still felt unwell, and for over 2 years, she lived with a lot of pain, migraines, and was unable to eat much of anything without getting sick. Jessica and her mother did a lot of research and believed that perhaps her gallbladder wasn't working well. After a Herculean amount of advocacy work, her gallbladder was removed and she got relief from the radiating pain she suffered from her migraines, but her medical journey wasn't over. Her kidneys started to shut down, so she needed a kidney transplant. Jessica has written about her medical odyssey in her book, The Heart of a Girl. Her sister, Amy, ended up donating the kidney she desperately needed.
I'm going to ask the panelists, how has transplant changed your quality of life? And are there things you are able to do now that you could not do before transplant? Guy?
Restriction of isometric exercise has been lifted to a degree. I'm able to walk more, have a better quality of life right now, and enjoy life to the best of my ability right now.
Lori?
Yeah, my quality of life has improved a ton. Before my transplant, like my last 6-minute walk test, I could only walk 183 meters. And yesterday I went on a 17-minute run. So just the difference in that quality is great. But just besides the physical activity as well, having a transplant has given me the freedom to not have to plan so far ahead and to not necessarily have to worry about what I do today impacting what I can do tomorrow. So that's been a whole new set of freedoms that I never had before.
And Jessica?
Yeah, I was 16 when I received my transplant, and my quality of life at that time, being in high school, was not good. I was in congestive heart failure, unable to really do much. I couldn't go to school. So I had homeschooling as much as I could stay awake for is pretty much what I remember. But I just remember a significant change in quality of life, quality of how I felt, night and day. You can't compare the two. I was able to get back to feeling whatever we call quote unquote normal, and jumping back into my senior year in high school and just going on to college and just continuing my life. Currently, I'm at 23 years post-transplant. So these last 23 years have been obviously life-changing. It's been 23 years going on 24. I'm very lucky to say that.
That is so awesome, Jessica. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Lori, you were on the list for over 400 days. You were still in school, dealing with the pandemic during that time. Can you tell us why you've chosen to continue your education in medicine?
Yeah, I think for me, I've always been interested in medicine, and I grew up originally wanting to be a doctor. Then I went to a medical school summer camp because that's the kind of person I was. And I decided that's not what I wanted to do. I didn't think my heart could keep up with it. And I went through a whole journey of trying to figure out what I wanted to do. But I think continuing school while I was in heart failure, especially after graduating from undergrad and even doing a master's while I was waiting for my transplant, it really helped me solidify what I didn't like and what I did. And while I was in the hospital for the last about 2 months of my wait, I met a lot of physician assistants, and I got to see all kinds of medical careers. And physician assistants were the ones I was like, I want your job. And so that's why I chose that route. But I also just want to use my experience as a patient in medicine to become a better provider in medicine. And as we've all been patients, we have seen some of the shortcomings and also some of the providers who do a really good job. And I just want to use my patient experience to give back to future patients.
Nice.
Jessica, you received your 2 organs at different times. We know from your bio that you received your heart, and then after that, you needed a kidney transplant. You wrote a book called The Heart of a Girl about your experience with receiving a heart and kidney transplant and the agonizing couple of years you went through before getting your gallbladder removed. It has been 7 years since your book was published. Tell us about the biggest change that has happened in your life since you published your book.
Oh, the biggest change. I will say 2 different jobs within that period of time within the CHD community. I can't believe it's been 7 years. Looking back, I really was able to write the book because of my sister. I didn't even ask her. She just was like, I'm donating my kidney. And I'm like, no. Obviously, she insisted, and here we are. We're also 14 years post kidney transplant as of April. So she really made me stop and think about sharing my story, because from that point prior, I hadn't shared really anything. I was very private about my heart stuff and my medical journey. So it was just a family issue. But since she was proceeding to donate, I really was, not in a bad way, forced to talk about what was happening, because we were in the process of fundraising for the kidney. Thus, I just decided the job I had at the time, I was like, I'm going to quit. I'm going to write the book. It took me 2 years. I think eventually I'll circle back to promoting the book more. It's not that I haven't had the opportunity. It's just the time. I'm not the best at selling myself per se, but I am a big advocate. So it really doesn't make sense, but I can share my story and talk about it. And when it comes to the book, I'm a little bit more reserved, and I don't know why, to be honest. But since that, I have worked for the Children's Heart Foundation for the last 4 years, and I just took on a new job at Lurie Children's Hospital at the Research Institute. I'm in the Office of Sponsored Programs, so I'm helping PIs, which are primary investigators, doctors, submit their research so they can be funded for whatever research they're submitting for. I've mostly been working, just, one of those things because I have to.
But you are crucially providing an integral role in the research, which I think is awesome.
Yeah, I think we all are, though. When I was at Children's Heart Foundation, I was very involved in a lot of CHD things that related not only to my job, but past that. But I'm trying to figure that portion out now since switching jobs, because it's just been a lot. But yeah, I will never give up the advocacy work and support and push for more research, even as a transplant patient, because there are some things that need to be discussed and considered when a second transplant is your only option.
Awesome. That's so awesome. Thank you for sharing that with us. Guy, I got a question for you, but before I ask this, I think it's very crucial that all of our listeners understand that each of us have our own process that we go through when we go through transplantation. And for every person, it's different. With that knowledge out there is something that I tell all the people that I try to mentor as a transplant candidate. And my question is, what is the recovery process for you look like?
My recovery process in the beginning was difficult because I had to be assisted out of bed with mechanical devices. Yeah, physical limitations, gross motor is always a problem for me too. But I got better, I improved, and I went to inpatient rehab, which I spent a week because I got COVID. Then I went back to the general floor at St. Mary's Hospital here at Mayo Clinic. After I got out, I became more active. I did outpatient rehab, which helped, and physical therapy as well. My voice sounds like a truck ran over it, not in the best possible way. So now I'm also doing speech, which is helping. Besides that, my heart is doing really well. Last week, my mom and I went to see my electrophysiologist. He said he was amazed looking at my echo. He was very proud of that. He listened to me. He was elated at how I sound internally. My journey has been very different than others, and I love it because it's given me the perspective that I've had after every operation I've had in the past, which were 7, not including this one. My eyes just opened up more, and I was able to see things in a much clearer manner. Thank you for the question, Jason.
Thank you. Yeah, it was fantastic. It's so interesting to hear all the different recipients and what they went through, because again, all of us have our own journeys, and my journey is exclusive to me, and what happened to me may not happen to you or someone else. So I just think that's very important to express that.
I totally agree. Each of us have had our own journeys through transplantation, and some of us had struggles and we overcame them every step of the way. For the next question, I'd like for each of the panelists to talk about transplant medications, side effects, and complications post-transplant. Jessica?
Like Leslie and Jason have said, all our journeys are very different. Well, the thing that doesn't change is the medication, honestly. If I say Prograf, Cellcept, Imuran, we all know what we're talking about. Prednisone for sure, because we've all been on that pretty standard of care for the medications. And side effects, yeah, I had some side effects early on. I get my medicine adjusted occasionally now. I'm on Prograf and Imuran, and it's based on our blood levels. So minor adjustments at this point. But early on, I was on a very high dose of prednisone. And I think within the first year or so, I developed diabetes because of that. And then the Prograf didn't help. The Prograf is what added to the kidney failure. And I was on CellCept, and the CellCept had complications with the gallbladder. So there are a lot of little things that can turn into major issues. One being the harshness on the liver and our other organs that are native to our bodies prior to the transplant. So Prograf really affected my kidneys, basically complete renal failure when my sister Amy obviously had to donate, because you just don't get put on an organ transplant list for any other major reason than you're in failure. So early on, my rejection was not high, but I had rejection for a few years, and I developed diabetes and needed to be on like the injections for 2 years. And thankfully, I don't know how, but I was able to stop all medications for diabetes, and I haven't had a problem since. But this medication can only last so long. And the longer you're post-transplant, I'm not trying to scare anybody, it's just the reality. But the longer you're post-transplant and on these medications, other issues develop. So hardening and narrowing of your arteries, which is where I'm at right now. I've had 5 stents placed to protect my arteries, but I hope that I have another 2 to 5 years before I need to be retransplanted. That's just the reality. We all have those bumps and setbacks, and then you're good for a good while with those minor adjustments the longer you're out. By no means was it easy, but you just get used to it.
Thank you for sharing. Guy?
I'm relatively new to this whole process. My operation was done October 1st of last year. So yesterday was my 9-month anniversary. I've had a couple of minor things here and there. I feel itchy. One person said it's because of the tacro. I don't know. I haven't asked my doctor yet. Medication-wise, I feel good. I sound like I've got a frog up my throat. But other than that, I'm feeling good.
That's good to hear.
Thanks.
Lori?
I'm in the middle of Jessica and Guy. I'm a little over 2 years out from transplant, and I had some pretty rough rejection early on. It was while I was still inpatient. I had my first biopsy and it came back as almost a 3R. And for those who are not familiar, rejection is rated on a scale from 0R to 3R, with 0R being absolutely no rejection. And at most centers, 0R and 1R are acceptable, and then you treat for 2 and over. So my first biopsy came back as a very high 2R. And so we treated with methylprednisone and some IVIG. And I went back to the cath lab to have another biopsy the next week, and I was still at a 2R. So they had to bring out the big guns, and that's like very expensive IV medication to try to knock it down. And thankfully, after that, I was back down to a 1R. And I actually had my first 0R rejection this past March. So 2 years later, I finally got to the 0 rejection mark. But for me, the medications have been a roller coaster. Whenever people ask me how my recovery went and everything, I always tell them that the first 3 months sucked. It's not fun. I feel like I was just waiting for my medication alarm to go off because I was taking medication like 3 or 4 times a day. And I wasn't really able to do a whole lot because I was just waiting for the next time to take medication. But then once you got past the 3-month mark, it started getting a little bit better. And then after the 6-month mark, it like medication time back down to 2 times a day for me, which wasn't difficult. And I had been used to taking medication because I'm a CHD patient. You take medication anyway. So that wasn't really the hard part of it. But these medications have some crazy side effects. Prednisone was my worst enemy. I pretty much had every single side effect except diabetes. Even at the age of 24, I got a cataract. So I had to get that removed last December, which they don't like to do. So I had to go to a very specialist ophthalmologist to get that removed. And also my other huge side effect are tacrolimus tremors. And most people have them. And most people, they get better over time. For me, my body just processes medication pretty quickly. So I had to be on like really high doses of tacrolimus both times per day to have my levels where they wanted them. And so I was just tremoring all the time. And everybody kept saying, hang in, it'll get better. For me, it never got better. It actually only ever got worse. And also I was on mycophenolate, which is also CellCept. And that one caused like major GI issues. Like I almost had some gastroparesis type symptoms, and that was not fun. And so finally last August, I told my transplant team, I'm like, okay, I can't keep dealing with these tremors. And so they took me off of the CellCept, which honestly, I didn't even know they were going to do, but it completely resolved my GI issues. And then we were able to lower my tacrolimus dose and start me on a different drug called sirolimus, which is Rapamune. It just impacts differently. It's also less harsh on the kidneys. My kidneys were starting to take a hit. So as you can see, the medication game is just a balance of what's going to work best for you. How does your body react to all the different drugs? And yeah, that's been my experience with all the different medications.
That's incredible, Lori, because you were talking about some of the things that I had personally completely forgot about with some of these side effects, like the tremors. You're right. I had the tremors too, but I totally forgot about them. I've been real fortunate that a lot of my medications, and I should be knocking on wood. First of all, I've had no rejection at all, ever since my transplant started. And I'm now 4.5 years post. And my medications, the doctors say, yeah, you're on like a really low dose of just about everything. And I've had other transplant recipients tell me the same thing, where they're just like, my God, I can't believe you're on such a low dose of this and this. It's just because, again, we're all different. My body just happens to love the medication that I'm taking. It loves my new organs, and my new organs love my body. Like, it's such a symmetrical thing for me that makes it so much better. So that's incredible, though, to hear your viewpoints. And I think that's one of the nicer things, because you're 2 years post, Lori. So to hear from yourself and Guy that are the more recent transplant recipients, and then you start getting to my age where it's like, oh yeah, I'm 4.5 years and I forgot about a lot of this stuff, because you go on with your life. And so yes, that's interesting that you did that.
Yeah.
If I can interject also, I completely relate to the CellCept. It was so hard on my stomach and GI once I switched to Imuran. And it had been, it was like more than 10 years post-transplant. I was having stomach aches, and obviously when tests to check what is going on in my gut and GI, and my GI doctor, there was a possibility that the CellCept could have some impact on your gallbladder. We don't know, as they never know with any of the transplant medications, what, if that's true or not. And it did, with his research, it did show that CellCept could affect gallbladder, and it definitely had the same effect on me. And once I stopped, I could not believe the difference in how I felt. And obviously I dealt with it for a long time, but you're just trying to do the best you can with the medications you have. And we're all told, there's going to be side effects, but that I definitely experienced that as well. So I completely understand that CellCept.
Have any of you had CMV?
No, but I am experiencing EBV right now, and I know it's completely different. But also another thing is, like, with these medications, that sometimes you have to treat different viruses and stuff. They're expensive, and insurance doesn't want to cover them. So it's always like a back and forth fight with insurance between you and your coordinators.
What are you talking about, Ari?
Oh, I asked a question if anyone had CMV, which is a virus related to organs.
Okay. The one thing I wanted to add to what was said is, think of us as being tightrope walkers. We have to balance ourselves with the medications to see how much we need, how much is going to be good for us, and filter one way, something else might happen to something else. That finding that fine line of what is acceptable and what is not acceptable for us in our bodies to react to the medications. I've had these problems myself also.
No, you're absolutely right, Guy. And it's very true. Transplant recipients, they obviously want to keep your immune system suppressed enough to where your body does not attack your new organs, but not so suppressed to where the slightest little sneeze can kill you. So it's a very fine line. And a lot of that comes in with adjusting of the medications, specifically within the first year. It's crucially important. Generally, once they get all those adjustments down and they start seeing this pattern that, okay, things are working, generally, you don't have any other issues after that. However, it's transplant. It can still happen. So
with the suppressed immune system, it is interesting because even if you go into a new environment, like I started going to in-person classes again, and I've been pretty religious on wearing a mask, mainly because I just don't want to get sick. Like I don't have time to deal with it. But I have gone a little lax because I'm going to be with the same two people for the next 2.5 years. And so I think I have a little bit of a cold right now, and I almost think that might be because my body is just adjusting to everybody else's germs in a way. And so obviously when you get a cold, you keep an eye on it. And if it gets bad, you let your team know. But we still get colds. Our bodies, even though they're immune suppressed, they can still fight them off. It just might take a little longer.
Absolutely.
I totally agree. I started working with children about a year ago. I've had cold after cold, ear infection, sinus infection, you name it, from October to roughly March. And so I knew that my transplant team knew about it, and I had the right medications and continued working.
Guy, Jessica, Lori, thank you all so very much for sharing all of your experiences. When we come back, it'll be time for the town hall audience to ask questions and share their experiences with us.
The CHC Congenital Heart Conversations podcast is a presentation of Hearts Unite the Globe, or HUG, and is part of the HUG Podcast Network. HUG is a nonprofit organization devoted to providing resources to the congenital heart defect community to enrich the lives of our community members. For free CHD resources, please visit our website at congenitalheartdefects.com.
You are listening to the CHC podcast. If you have a question or comment that you would like addressed on our show, please send an email to Anna Jaworski at anna@thechcpodcast.com. That's anna@thechcpodcast.com. Now, back to the CHC podcast.
Now is a chance for our audience members to ask questions if they would like to. And I have a question, first of all, for Lori. You talked to us about the cell sept and you talked to us about the tremoring, but you didn't tell us whether or not they're gone. You had me on the edge of my seat. Are your tremors gone now?
Not completely, unfortunately, which is interesting with the field that I'm going into. And so they're much better. Let's just say that they're much more manageable now. But if I do get a little cold, or I normally drink 2 cups of coffee a day, and that's all I have. But sometimes cups don't always brew the same. And so if there's slightly more caffeine than I'm used to, those will kick them off. If I get a little nervous, that'll do it. If I'm too cold, that'll do it. I've learned there's different triggers, but for the most part, the tremors are a little bit better. And so it's just going to be me trying to figure out how to work around them.
That's good to know. And it's good that you're becoming aware of what might trigger you to have those tremors. Mm-hmm. I know caffeine is a no for me. I have problems with caffeine myself. And I think as I get older, I'm becoming even more triggered by caffeine. I think it's good that you're aware of what caffeine does to your body. Okay. Is there anybody else who has a question they would like to ask?
Alicia, let's start with you.
So this question is for whoever wants to answer. I was just wondering, how has the transplant process affected your mental health? And I also want to know what parts of your life, if you have hobbies or someone who was there for you, someone who pulled you out of the harder times of going through the process.
That is a really good question because so many people don't have a strong support system, and My mom, my grandparents at the time when I was 16, they were still living. And my sister, of course, were very close. So I had a very strong support system. The process of transplantation is not easy. It's definitely a mind trip. Both times I was very surprised by the news that I needed a transplant and then the process. I had been taking medication since I was 5. So them questioning me about my medication routine, I understand where they're coming from, but that was pretty difficult, to be honest. And then I had gone in for my routine cath because I had been getting caths and MRIs alternating years. So every 2 years I would get a cath or a biopsy to check the pressure. Well, they don't do biopsies this far out, but check pressures in your heart. And it was like the 3rd stent or something that they put in. She came in and was like, we're going to have to rework you up for a transplant later on. And I did not expect that. I wasn't even thinking that. I think it was just really hard for me to wrap my head around the possibility of a second heart at some point. I'm really trying to just keep my health as best I can. And I am very religious and on top of my body and my medication. And my team knows me very well. And they also support me, which I am very grateful for. They know how I react to things. So they knew it wasn't going to be a very great reaction, and she prepared me for it. And she was there to support me. And so was my team when I went in for clinics. But thankfully, right now, I'm stable. And as far as hobbies, yeah, I push my limits as much as I can, but I know my limits. So mid to end of season last year, I started curling, and that was really fun and really hard because it's a sport and I totally need to be in better shape. And that's one of the things we're all bugged about. So I took up curling, and I'm really looking forward to the start of the new season. It's not until October because it's a winter sport, but that is one of the hobbies I have picked up. And my team also knows that I work in a hospital setting, and they were fine with it. They're like, oh yeah, go ahead.
That's so cool. Thank you for sharing. The curling sounds really fun.
Yeah, you're welcome. It is fun. It's a big learning curve. I have had a lot of fun with it. And I think it's a matter of just doing things. And if you're interested in something, try it. I didn't even ask my team. I don't ask my team everything. So I told them I was starting, and they're like, oh, that's so cool. So I want that to be out there too. As much as we rely on our teams, I don't you would think, oh, did you ask your team if you could curl? I'm like, why would I ask my team? So there has to be some balance and some independence, because transplants can take over everything. And they have. They do take over our entire lives when we're in the middle of them. And it's not until later that you can start getting back to a life outside of the transplant process, outside of being transplanted, the weight, the medication adjustments. And I think it's hard the first couple of years. Don't get me wrong. So it takes time.
Thank you. Can we call on Michael?
Yeah, Michael.
Thank you. My question is more about mental health, but I want to illustrate my question with a short story. We donated from my daughter almost everything she had. The only thing we really couldn't donate was the heart. We donated a set of lungs to a 66-year-old woman. 54-year-old woman got a liver and a pancreas. 45-year-old woman got a kidney, and a young 7.5-year-old girl got a kidney. We also sent other parts to the bank. And that's by way of background. One day, about a year later, I got a phone call from a woman I had never heard before, an older woman. And she started to introduce herself and tell her story. And that's when I realized that every breath she took and every word she said was coming from my daughter's lungs. And that was a very big moment for me. I later found out from her that her name is Mazal, which in Hebrew means fortune or luck. You might have heard Mazal Tov. And she was very lucky, but she was also very upset because she was suffering from tremendous guilt that Somebody had to die for her to get her lungs, which saved her life. I told her that was not really an issue that she needed to be concerned with, that my daughter had died anyway. That was when we decided to do the right thing and donate whatever we could, and that she's just a fortunate recipient, but nobody died for her. And she said, my family told me that, my rabbi told me that, the social worker told me that, but until I heard it from you, I didn't accept it. So my question is, did any of you suffer from that kind of survivor's guilt, and how do you deal with it? Because personally, as a parent of a donor, I don't think that you need to, but apparently she did. So how did you deal with that, if in fact you had it?
I actually had survivor's guilt. Not so much with my donor, but I had another CHD patient across the hallway. He was waiting for a triple organ transplant. And I was accepted for a heart transplant, and he was denied. He was able to live long enough to see his son graduate high school. Yeah, it's very difficult. I think about him now and again. But I'm also grateful that I had the opportunity to meet him, and also am very thankful that I had the opportunity to receive an organ, a heart transplant.
I agree with Leslie. I also had a survivor's guilt, but not for my donor. It was actually for a young gentleman who was like 16 years old, and he had a heart transplant. He was doing very well, and then just started dropping and not doing well. And he wound up passing away. And it was about 3 months after my transplant. And I was just like, why am I thriving? And this young man who still had his whole life ahead of him didn't do it. And then about a year after that, I was mentoring a transplant candidate, and she went in for her transplant and she didn't survive as well. And that was very difficult for me. And yeah, I don't buy into the fact that someone died to save me. My donor was an IV drug user, and that's all that I know about them. I have tried to reach out to the family multiple times, and I've not gotten anything back. So I've had to let go of that and just say, okay, you know what? There's a reason for everything, right? There's a reason why I'm not hearing back from the family. I don't have any survivor's guilt that someone died for me to live. I admit I never have. Someone told me very early on when I was going through my process that you can't view it that way, because that's not the case. The person is already going to die or has died. And it's not like they're saying, hey, I'm going to go and kill myself so that you can live. That's not at all what's happening. It's they were involved in some kind of an accident, whether it was God's creation of an accident or whatever the case may be. So they were already going to expire, and we're just the benefit of that. I feel very fortunate that I've been through what I've been through, even as difficult as it was for me. But no, I don't have any survivor's guilt.
I never really experienced this survivor's guilt either. I had always told myself that everybody has their time to die, and when they do, themselves and their family can make a decision if they're able to pass life on. For me, like Jason and Leslie, I call it thriver's guilt, where I'm watching all of my friends with CHD who are not doing well, and they're either not able to have a transplant or don't want a transplant. And I'm even seeing transplanted friends who aren't doing well. And I'm like, why am I the one that's doing well? I'm thankful for it, and I try my best to keep it that way. That's why I've stepped back from some of the CHD community as well. I try to pass on my knowledge and try to be helpful when I can. But in a way, I feel bad when I post, oh yeah, I just went for a run today, when I knew that with my CHD, I couldn't even walk like 2 football fields in 6 minutes. So that's been my experience with it.
My thing is, I never felt survivor's guilt or the other kind of guilt. It was just when I was going through the process, the first time the doctor mentioned the word transplant, my foot began to shake on purpose because it was something new that I had to deal with. And that was over 10 years ago. I had the ability to process it much more thoroughly. And Jason, for the 16-year-old kid, maybe he wasn't taking his medication on time, Maybe he didn't have a rhythm with the medications. I don't know. It could be anything that happened.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't know the circumstances behind it, but it still profoundly affected me just because, again, I'm going, look, I've lived a great life. When I went into my transplant, I think the biggest thing that I had to do was look back on my life and realize, you know what? I had already lived a great life. I had a very healthy son. I'd been training heart surgeons since I was 6 years old because my cases were study cases. So I've done a lot for our country. I volunteered with the Red Cross, deployed to major disasters in the country. I've been a good, outstanding member of society. And I was like, okay, I've had a good life. If I go through my transplant and I don't survive, I'm okay with that. And yet I did survive and I've thrived ever since. Believe me, it's been a huge difference. But here was this young man that had his whole life still ahead of him. And yet I already accepted that I'd lived my life and I'm okay. I'm going to move on if that's what time it is for me. So that's where my thriver's guilt came from.
I think for me, like I can relate to Lori and Jason somewhat. And Gift of Hope is there encouraging and supporting us, saying you can try and communicate. You can write a letter to the donor family. And my mom did. And we never got a response. I think because I was 16, it was a little different. And I was so used to having all kinds of heart, medical, everything my entire life that it was just like, okay, this is the next step. And this is just what you need to do. You got to do what you got to do. And that's how I grew up and how we've managed through all these battles. It was heartbreaking knowing a couple friends who passed just after transplant. My one friend, she was in the hospital and she never got to go home. And that was post-heart and she had a liver. And we would talk for hours. We had a really strong connection, but I think I was so used to being in the heart. That was my entire life growing up. I think if I stopped and thought about everything, it would just overtake me. And I couldn't do that if I wanted to get healthy and I wanted to get myself through the transplant. And it's just what I've done my whole life with everything. So I don't know if it was so much survivor's guilt. I know it was hard for my mom. It was definitely hard for my mom. Technically, we don't know specifics as per my donor, but we do know that it was a local 15-year-old. I'm in Chicago, and there was only one incident that evening that story that really could be the only person. But I think it was harder for my mom because I was just at an age where it was like, I wasn't processing that at all. And I think also that heart became mine, but you never, ever forget your donor and donor family, ever. And you're forever grateful. So I think it's a little bit different in my point of view, but that's also why I'm a huge advocate and I share my story every single place I can. And I'm involved in so much and continue to be involved in so much because it's just something I feel passionate about. It's something I know. And if it can help one other person, my job is done.
100% agree.
Anna Jaworski has written several books to empower the congenital heart defect or CHD community. These books can be found at Amazon.com or at her website, www.babyheartspress.com. Her bestseller is The Heart of a Mother, an anthology of stories written by women for women in the CHD community. Anna's other books, My Brother Needs an Operation, The Heart of a Father, and Hypoplastic Left Heart Syndrome, a handbook for parents, will help you understand that you are not alone. Visit babyheartspress.com to find out more.
This content is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. The opinions expressed in the podcast are not those of Hearts Unite the Globe, but of the hosts and guests, and are intended to spark discussion about issues pertaining to congenital heart disease or bereavement.
Welcome back. Now it's time for Anna Jaworski and Ayrton Beatty to talk about this episode with Leslie and me. Anna is a heart mom, and Ayrton is a bereaved sibling, CHD in her own right. They're working behind the scenes during the town hall meeting.
What did you think about the show?
I'll go first. I'm Anna. And first of all, I want to say thank you to our patrons who were part of the town hall audience. So thank you, Michael Lieben, Hope Jaworski, and Alicia Lynch. I'm just so excited that our patrons have an opportunity with this program to be part of the episode. So what did I think of the program? Oh my gosh, I think we could probably have spoken for days on this topic. I think this is something we're going to have to revisit again next year. But I absolutely loved how Leslie and Jason were able to relate to the panelists and share some of their own experiences, and how even though Jessica had her transplant so many years before Leslie or Jason, or especially Guy or Lori, they still had so many similar experiences. And I just thought that was fantastic. I also loved how organic the conversation was. Everything just seemed to really flow.
With what happened with my brother, we weren't given the option to go down the route for donating his organs. When you were talking about having the guilt around donation, we actually felt guilty as a family that we weren't able to help other people not go through what we did. So it was actually quite hard for me to listen to that discussion, but at the same time, it was really nice hearing that.
I'm not exactly sure I understand, Ayrton. Did your brother want to be an organ donor, but because of the way he died, he wasn't able to be one?
He did say before he passed that he wanted to be an organ donor, but by the time we found him the morning after, it'd been too long. His organs were no longer viable.
Yeah, I had a friend that happened to also. She passed unexpectedly. She lived alone. And a few of us were surprised not to hear from her at a certain point. And one of the friends went to her house and found her, but by then it was too long and nothing could be donated. So I understand in a way that's another loss that you suffered, isn't it?
Yeah, because he was just typical 19-year-old, so full of life. He wanted life to go on, and in the same way we wanted his life to go on as much as we could.
And this is why it's so important that you let your family members know of your intentions to be an organ donor. I'm an organ donor, although with my transplant, obviously they can't use my heart or my liver because they're not mine, which I found was interesting that I could still be an organ donor after my transplant. But yeah, it's very important, and society's made it so much easier now to be an organ donor. You can set it up on your phone automatically to where if an ambulance has to come and get you and they have to pronounce you, they can tell right away, yes, this person's an organ donor. So they will do what they can to try and harvest the organs as quickly as possible.
In the UK now, you're automatically registered as an organ donor unless you decide to opt out.
See, and I like that. And I've heard about that before. I think that's what they should do here because it's so difficult to try to get organ donors. I'm an ambassador for Donate Life, and I go around doing tons and tons of conferences and speaking to get people signed up for it. And so many people are like, yeah, I want to be an organ donor. And then, I'll go home and do it tonight. And they never do it. So I think we're missing a huge amount of people that could really be able to do it. So I agree. I think that the opt-in should follow suit.
I also agree. I was just recently in Europe, and they also do opt-in in the Netherlands that I found out, and Belgium as well, and probably a couple other countries in Europe.
I think the reason why we don't have it here is because some people have religious beliefs and concerns about it. Like Michael was saying.
Well, yeah, in that case, they can just opt out.
From that point of view, I don't think they're going to automatically allow it.
That's a good point. Anna and Ayrton, what surprised you the most out of this conversation today?
I think since we first started talking about doing this town hall, I was doing research about the history of transplantation, and it's just how quickly technology has come on since they were first started in the 1960s. Because in those days, I think the patients only survived for a few days at a time. But now people are surviving decades before needing a secondary transplant, and also the medication, which helps them as well.
I can't believe Jessica's as old as she is.
I agree.
I love her to death. I've known her
You
for
and
such
me
a
both.
long...
You and me both.
I've loved you and known you for such a long time. I can't believe it's been over 2 decades, Jessica. I'm just thrilled to see that Jessica looks so healthy, and I think that gives so much hope to other people who might need a transplant. I imagine it is scary if you're told, okay, you can be listed for transplant, but you might need another one at a certain point in time, and to get yourself in that headspace where you're ready for that. But all of you spoke so eloquently about getting a transplant and the way that you have handled it. I think what really surprised me was how all of you have accepted the consequences. Some of you really went through some bad side effects, and yet you're all still so upbeat. So that gives me hope that if my daughter needs a transplant or any of my friends need transplants, that they'll have good teams that are working with them. And even if they do have some undesirable consequences, that they'll still be able to have a good quality of life.
Leslie, was there something that surprised you with this conversation?
Not so much. For me, I guess the comment about the UK and having a recent trip to Europe, finding out once you're 18, it's automatic that you become an organ donor, which I found very interesting.
Interesting. I think for me, it's Jessica, you telling us your story, and again, 2 decades with a heart transplant. First of all, it's got to be amazing to be at such a young age and need a transplant. I always knew that I needed one since I was 6 years old, but it was always on the back burner. And so for you to go through that at such a young age, and then to find out that the medications have not really changed a whole lot, like, I'm shocked by that. I'm totally shocked, because generally medicine changes so quickly, but to still have the same medications that they were using 20, 30 years ago, it just blows me away. I would think that there's something better out there.
Yeah. And you know what? That's the hope. That's the hope of the future, them finding that medication that can be a little bit better. Not saying that this medication isn't good. It is. Look how far we've all come. But maybe there's something on the horizon that has less side effects and more protection of the transplanted heart. So that's my hope. But I've been hearing a lot of that come up lately, that medications haven't changed. What are we going to do about it when people who don't tolerate them, in whatever combination it is, who need them? I'm very curious to see what happens.
It might be surprising for other people, but it hits close to home. There is an author named Amy Silverstein who had a heart transplant years ago, and she recently passed. But before she passed, she wrote a New York Times piece about her life and living with transplant, and how medications and things really have not improved, and there needs to be more research into it. So I think there is still a lot of room to grow in the transplant world, and that does give hope, but it always seems to be on the horizon. So hopefully, as we advocate for transplant, those horizons come closer and we get drugs that will have less side effects. But even as it is right now, I run into a lot of congenital heart patients who are just terrified of transplant. They don't want to do it. Transplant's not really the end of the road. It's the end of one road, but it gives you a new road of hope. It's definitely going to have bumps along the way. Every road has some potholes, but it's a detour in life, and it extends the road a little bit. And so I think CHDers should really think about transplant if that is ever brought up to them, rather than just outright saying no. I think transplant does provide hope in the long run.
I agree with you, Lori, and that's a great point. A lot of people, they don't want to do the transplant simply because there's not a lot out there that talks about it. And that's why when I went through my transplant, I made it very open. I documented everything about my transplant because I was having a hard time trying to find information on what to expect through the process. It is a challenging process, but it can be done, and it can be done very successfully. But there's not enough knowledge out there.
For me, I had a friend that went through transplantation, so I did have that background knowledge and her experience in Pittsburgh. So I did know what to expect per se, not 100%, but I had some background knowledge.
I think if you grow up in the CHD world, you have some sort of knowledge and more of a place to get an explanation from. But going back just a moment to Amy Silverstein, I saw that again, another heartbreaking story where medications caused cancer. And that's one of the things that we have to be very careful of. Why we get our blood drawn. It's why we stay out of the sun. All of those little extra things we can do. But at the end, for her, it was a side effect of the medication. And that's why I think the conversation as far as the drugs and the medication goes is going to continue, because there are significant side effects. And like we've talked throughout the whole program, everybody is different. All the medications affect everyone differently, but you can't help but to have a reaction when you hear that. So it has that emotional effect on me. And then it's, okay, my mind goes, now what do we do? Or this is just another thing we have to watch out for.
So the last question is, what was your biggest takeaway from the show? Anna and Artin?
Yeah, for me, I think that the biggest takeaway was that people who receive transplants can lead such an amazing life, and it's not quite as handicapping a condition as I was afraid it might be. So even though there are immunosuppressions on board, it seems that you guys have been doing amazingly. In fact, Leslie couldn't even record the episode earlier because she was hopping from one country to another in Europe, and she wanted to be home to do the recording. So I think my biggest takeaway is the tremendous feeling of hope I received from all of you. Ayrton?
Yeah, like you, I usually thought that if somebody had a transplant, because of the medications that they took, they had to live in a protective bubble because of being immunocompromised. But knowing that people can go out and live normal lives and be active, you wouldn't know they had a transplant at all unless they decided to tell you. And what I've learned tonight just by listening in has just completely blown my mind.
Thank you for joining us today on the CHC podcast. We hope you'll join us next month for our town hall meeting, where we'll be talking about gratitude. Until then, I'm Jason Crutchley.
And I'm Leslie Castro.
Have a great day and keep those congenital heart conversations going on Facebook and on Instagram.
Thank you for joining us. The CHC podcast can be heard monthly wherever you get your podcasts. Visit us on Facebook or Instagram to continue the conversations. Join the Hearts Unite the Globe Patreon group and become part of our town hall meetings. It's simple. Just visit www.heartsunitetheglobe.org and select the tab that says Donate to Hug with Patreon. Then you too can be part of the conversation.